moment my best friend stepped onto the assembly stage with a trembling microphone in her hand. I knew exactly how this would end, because I had already lived through it once, already died because of it once, already learned what it meant to be kind in a world that rewards cruelty and punishes restraint. And this time, as the entire school turned their attention toward her, toward the girl everyone adored, the girl I once trusted more than my own reflection, I did nothing. I didn't reach out, didn't grab her wrist, didn't whisper the warning that had once saved her from humiliation, because the truth was simple and cold and sharp enough to cut through every illusion I had ever held. Saving her had been the beginning of my destruction, and I refused to make that mistake again. The gymnasium was suffocatingly bright. Rows of students packed shoulder to shoulder, whispers rippling like static through the air as the teachers lined the walls pretending to maintain order while secretly just as curious as the rest. And at the center of it all stood her Lena, with her soft voice and carefully practiced vulnerability, the same expression she had worn in my past life when she had turned everything against me. And across from her, leaning lazily against the stage stairs with his hands in his pockets, was the boy everyone feared, the so-called school bully, the untouchable king of whispered rumors and half-truths, the one people avoided in hallways and blamed for things they couldn't explain. And yet, as my gaze settled on him now, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before: clarity. In my past life, I had believed the stories about him, believed he was dangerous, believed Lena when she told me she was scared of him, believed I was protecting her when I dragged her off that stage before she could finish her confession. And I remembered every detail of that moment, the way her fingers had tightened around mine, the way her eyes had widened, the way the entire room had turned to stare at me instead of her. And I remembered what came after. How she cried and told everyone I had sabotaged her because I was jealous. How the whispers began. How my name became something ugly in people's mouths. How the truth didn't matter because she had already decided the narrative. And most of all, I remembered how I died, alone and unhurt, with the bitter realization that the person I had tried to save had been the one who pushed me into the abyss. So now, standing at the back of the crowd, hidden in plain sight, I simply watched. Lena raised the microphone, her voice shaking just enough to seem real, just enough to pull sympathy from the crowd as she spoke his name. And a hush fell over the gym, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the spectacle to unfold. And I could almost hear the echoes of my past life overlapping with this moment, almost feel the phantom pull of my own hand reaching out to stop her. But I forced myself to remain still, because this time, I wasn't here to save anyone. I was here to witness the truth. "I like you," she said, her words soft but amplified through the speakers, carrying to every corner of the room. And a wave of murmurs followed, students leaning closer, phones already being raised to capture the moment. Because public confessions were entertainment here, drama was currency, and humiliation, well, humiliation was unforgettable. In my past life, this was where everything had changed, where I had intervened, where I had believed I was doing the right thing. But now, I let the seconds stretch, let her continue, let her dig her own grave with every carefully chosen. And for the first time, I truly paid attention, not as her friend, not as someone blinded by loyalty, but as an observer. And what I saw was something I had completely missed before: calculation. Her pauses were too precise, her breaths too controlled, her gaze flickering not with genuine fear but with expectation, as if she was waiting for something, waiting for a specific reaction, waiting for the scene to play out exactly as she had envisioned. And that realization sent a quiet, almost imperceptible chill down my spine, because it confirmed what I had only begun to suspect. This had never been a spontaneous confession. It had always been a performance. The boy she was confessing to didn't react immediately, and the silence that followed stretched long enough to make people uncomfortable, long enough for anticipation to twist into tension. And then slowly, he straightened, pushing himself off the wall with a casual ease that made it seem like none of this mattered to him at all, like the entire school wasn't watching, like Lena's confession was nothing more than background noise. And when he finally looked at her, really looked at her, something shifted in the air, something subtle but undeniable, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain. My pulse quickened. In my past life, I had never seen this part, never allowed it to happen. So this, whatever this was, felt like stepping into unknown territory, like walking a path I had deliberately avoided before. And I realized, with a strange sense of detachment, that this was the moment everything would diverge, the moment my decision not to interfere would begin to reshape the future. Lena swallowed, her grip tightening around the microphone as she waited, her entire body leaning forward just slightly, as if trying to pull the answer she wanted out of him through sheer will. And I wondered, not for the first time, what she truly expected, what outcome she had planned for, because if there was one thing I understood now, it was that she never acted without a purpose. The boy tilted his head, studying her in a way that made the silence feel heavier, more oppressive, and then finally he spoke. His voice low but clear enough to carry across the room without the need for amplification. And the moment the first word left his lips, I knew instinctively, irrevocably, that this was not going to go the way she had intended. "You like me," he repeated, as if testing the words, as if finding them almost amusing. And a ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, quickly stifled as people leaned in closer, sensing that something was about to happen, something worth remembering. And Lena nodded quickly, her expression softening into something vulnerable, something practiced, something I had once believed without question. And for a brief, fleeting second, I felt the ghost of my old self stir, the version of me who would have stepped in, who would have tried to protect her from whatever was coming next. But that version of me was gone, buried along with the life she had helped destroy. "Then you should have tried harder," he said. And the words, simple as they were, landed with a weight that immediately shifted the atmosphere. Confusion flashing across Lena's face as she struggled to process what he meant. And I felt my lips curve ever so slightly, not in amusement, but in recognition, because I could see it now, could see the cracks forming in her carefully constructed performance, could see the moment where control began to slip from her grasp. "I don't understand," she said, her voice faltering just enough to betray her unease. And he stepped closer, each movement unhurried, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world, as if this entire situation existed solely for his convenience. And when he reached the edge of the stage, he stopped, looking up at her with an expression that was neither cruel nor kind, but something far more dangerous, knowing. "You spent weeks getting close to me," he continued, his tone almost conversational, as if they were discussing something trivial instead of dismantling her in front of hundreds of witnesses. "But you never actually paid attention." The murmurs grew louder now, curiosity sharpening into something more focused, more intent. And Lena's composure wavered, her fingers tightening around the microphone as she forced a laugh that sounded just slightly too high, too strained. And I watched, silent and still, as the scene unfolded exactly as it was meant to, just not in the way she had planned. "What are you talking about?" she asked. And for the first time, there was a genuine hint of uncertainty in her voice, a crack in the facade that she couldn't fully hide. And he smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to send a ripple of unease through the room. "If you're going to pretend to like someone," he said, "you should at least make it believable." The words hit harder than any outright rejection, because they didn't just dismiss her feelings, they exposed them as something false, something calculated, something unworthy of even basic acknowledgement. And the effect was immediate, the crowd shifting, whispers turning sharp, questioning, the narrative beginning to tilt in a direction she hadn't anticipated. And I could see it in her eyes, the moment she realized she was losing control, the moment she understood that this wasn't going to end the way she wanted. And as I stood there, watching her carefully constructed image begin to crack under the weight of a truth she couldn't easily deny, I felt something settle deep within me, something cold and steady and unshakable. Because this was only the beginning. And for the first time since my rebirth, I allowed myself to fully embrace the role I had chosen, the path I had committed to, the outcome I intended to create. And as Lena's gaze flickered across the crowd, searching, desperate, until it finally landed on me, locking onto my eyes with a mixture of accusation and dawning realization, I didn't look away, didn't soften, didn't offer the silent reassurance she had once relied on, because she was finally starting to understand what I had already accepted the moment I chose not to stop her. This time, I wasn't her savior, and I would never be again. The silence that followed his words didn't feel like emptiness, it felt like pressure. Like the air itself had thickened, pressing down on every person in the room as Lena stood frozen on stage. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and panic. And for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire school needed a second to recalibrate the story they thought they were watching. Because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Not for a girl like her, not in a scene she had so clearly prepared to control. And yet control had already slipped from her fingers. And the worst part was that she knew it. Then came the whispers. Quiet at first, barely audible over the hum of the speakers, but growing, spreading, multiplying as students leaned toward each other, exchanging glances, pulling out their phones, replaying the moment in real time as if they needed confirmation that what they had just witnessed was real. And Lena, sweet, harmless Lena, was no longer the heroine of this scene, but something far more fragile, far more exposed. And I watched it happen with a clarity that bordered on cruel, because I had seen the other version of this before, the one where I intervened. The one where she cried into my shoulder afterward and thanked me for saving her. The one where she turned that gratitude into a weapon and used it to destroy me. And now, seeing this version unfold instead, I felt nothing resembling guilt, only a quiet, steady certainty that I had chosen correctly. Lena's fingers trembled slightly around the microphone as she forced herself to speak again. Her voice tighter now, less controlled, the cracks no longer something she could fully hide as she tried to regain her footing. Tried to steer the narrative back to something she could manage, something she could survive. That's not true, she said, the hesitation just noticeable enough to betray her. And a few students near the front exchanged looks, their expressions shifting from curiosity to skepticism. Because doubt, once introduced, spreads faster than anything else, and she had just given it a foothold. The boy didn't respond immediately, didn't rush to press the advantage, and that restraint made him far more dangerous than any overt aggression could have. Because it meant he understood exactly what he was doing, exactly how much space to give her before tightening the pressure. And when he finally spoke, his tone remained calm, almost bored, as if this entire situation was beneath him. Really, he asked, and the single word carried more weight than a full accusation. Because it wasn't defensive, wasn't emotional, it was dismissive. And Lena flinched just barely, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. I shifted slightly where I stood, not a step forward, not to intervene, but simply to get a better view. Because every detail mattered now. Every reaction, every misstep, every flicker of truth breaking through the mask she had spent so long perfecting. And I wasn't going to miss any of it. Then explain something to me, he continued, his gaze steady on her, unyielding in a way that made it clear he wasn't going to let this go. Why did you tell your friend that I was just a stepping stone? The words landed like a dropped glass in a silent room. Sharp, unmistakable, impossible to ignore, and the reaction was immediate. The whispers turning into something louder, more pointed, as heads turned, eyes widened, and Lena's face lost what little color it had left, her entire body going rigid as the implications settled over the crowd. For a split second, her eyes flickered just a glance, quick and instinctive, and landed on me. There it was, recognition, suspicion, fear, and beneath it all, the beginning of understanding. I held her gaze without flinching, my expression calm, unreadable, giving her nothing to grasp onto, nothing to use. Because this was the moment she started to realize that I wasn't where she expected me to be, wasn't playing the role she had assigned me, and that uncertainty would do more damage to her than anything I could say out loud. I never said that, she stammered, but the denial came too quickly, too defensively, and even she seemed to realize it a second too late, her grip tightening around the microphone as if it could anchor her, as if it could somehow pull her back into control. But control was already gone, slipping further away with every passing second. The boy tilted his head slightly, studying her with an expression that bordered on indifferent. And for a moment, I wondered if this was how he always looked at people, like they were puzzles he had already solved, like their reactions were predictable, inevitable, and therefore not worth much of his effort. You're right, he said after a pause, and Lena's shoulders relaxed just slightly, hope flickering back into her eyes as she seized onto the possibility that he might back down, that he might give her an opening to recover. But then he continued, his voice just as even as before. You didn't say it to me. The relief that had barely begun to form on her face shattered instantly, replaced by something far closer to panic. And the crowd reacted in kind, the tension snapping into something sharper, more focused, because now there was a story here. Now there was something worth paying attention to, something that went beyond a simple rejection and into something messier, more revealing, more entertaining. So who did you say it to? Someone called out from the crowd. The question bold, intrusive, but perfectly aligned with the mood that had taken over the room. And Lena's eyes darted around, searching for an escape that didn't exist, searching for a version of this where she could still come out on top. But every path was closing one by one, and she knew it. I could see the calculation returning, the frantic attempt to rebuild a strategy from the pieces that remained. And for a moment, I almost admired it, the way her mind worked even under pressure, the way she refused to completely collapse. But admiration didn't mean mercy, and I had none left to give her. This is ridiculous, she said, forcing a small, brittle laugh as she tried to regain some semblance of control. You're just making things up because you don't want to accept my feelings. It was a decent attempt, shifting the narrative back toward him, framing his accusation as a defense mechanism, something born from discomfort rather than truth. And under different circumstances, it might have worked, might have been enough to muddy the waters, to create doubt, to buy her time. But she had already lost the most important advantage, credibility. The boy didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look particularly bothered. And that lack of reaction undermined her words more effectively than any counterargument could have. Because if he wasn't defensive, if he wasn't angry, then what reason did he have to lie? The question hung unspoken in the air, shaping the way people looked at her, the way they began to reassess everything they thought they knew. If you say so, he replied simply, and the dismissal in his tone hit harder than any accusation, because it made her argument irrelevant, made her struggle to regain control seem small, almost desperate, and I saw the moment it truly began to fall apart for her. The moment she realized that this wasn't just a bad outcome, it was a losing game. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice cut through the noise, clear and sharp, carrying just enough excitement to draw immediate attention. "Wait, check the group chat." It was like a spark hitting dry grass. Phones were lifted almost in unison, screens lighting up as students opened messages, notifications popping, eyes scanning quickly, and I didn't need to see the content to know exactly what they were looking at, because I had timed it perfectly, calculated the moment down to the second, ensuring that the reveal would hit when the tension was at its peak, when the doubt was already seated, when the impact would be impossible to ignore. Lena's breathing hitched, her gaze flicking from face to face as she saw the shift happen in real time, the confusion turning into realization, the curiosity sharpening into something far more dangerous, and then slowly, almost as if she already knew what she would find, she lowered her eyes to her own phone, her hands trembling just enough to betray her as she unlocked the screen. The video wasn't long, 30 seconds at most, but it didn't need to be, because it showed exactly what it needed to show. Nothing more, nothing less. Sitting in a cafe, her posture relaxed, her voice casual, her expression unguarded in a way it never was in public, saying the words clearly, unmistakably, "He's just a stepping stone. Once I get close to his family, everything else will follow." There was no context to hide behind, no ambiguity to exploit, just her voice, her face, her intent, captured and delivered at the worst possible moment. And as the realization spread through the crowd, as the whispers turned into something louder, more pointed, more unforgiving, I watched her world begin to collapse in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. Because this time, I wasn't the one at the center of it. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, searching, frantic, until they found me again, locking onto my gaze with a force that felt almost physical. And in that moment, there was no more pretending, no more carefully constructed innocence, just raw accusation, raw fury, and beneath it a single, terrifying question: how? I didn't look away. I didn't smile. I didn't need to, because the answer was already written in everything I had done, in every choice I had made since the moment I opened my eyes in this life again. And as the noise around us grew louder, as the narrative shifted beyond her control, as the first cracks turned into fractures, I let her see it, just for a second, just enough to understand. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This was design. And for the first time, she was the one who had no idea what would happen next. For a moment, Lena didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe, as if her mind had simply refused to process what she had just seen, what everyone else had just seen, and the stillness around her felt unnatural, like the pause before something breaks beyond repair. But the world didn't wait for her to catch up, didn't give her time to rebuild the mask she had relied on for so long, because the whispers were no longer whispers now. They were voices, clear, loud, overlapping, relentless, and every single one of them chipped away at the image she had so carefully constructed. Is that really her? She said that, so it was all fake. The questions spread like wildfire, feeding into each other, growing sharper, more accusatory with every repetition, and Lena's fingers tightened around her phone until her knuckles turned white, her entire body trembling now, not with the delicate vulnerability she used to perform, but with something real, something uncontrolled, something that couldn't be reshaped into sympathy, no matter how hard she tried. This is edited," she said suddenly, her voice breaking through the noise, louder than before, almost desperate, and for a split second, the crowd hesitated, the possibility hanging in the air just long enough to matter. Because doubt, even when fragile, can still shift the direction of a story, and Lena clung to that hesitation like it was her last lifeline. "You can fake anything now," she continued quickly, her words rushing out as if speed alone could make them more convincing. "Someone is trying to frame me. It was a smart move. Technically speaking, redirect the narrative, introduce uncertainty, create an invisible enemy, but she had miscalculated one critical factor: timing. If she had said this earlier, before the tension peaked, before the doubt took root, it might have worked, might have been enough to split the room, to buy her space to recover. But now, with everything already in motion, it felt like what it was: a reaction, not a strategy, and reactions are always weaker than plans. The boy on the floor of the stage, still calm, still watching her like this was nothing more than a mildly interesting distraction, didn't immediately respond. And that silence did more damage than any argument could have, because it left her words hanging unsupported, unvalidated. And the crowd, already leaning toward disbelief, had no reason to shift back. "If it's fake," someone called out again, emboldened by the lack of pushback, "then why does it sound exactly like you?" A few scattered laughs followed, not loud, not cruel yet, but sharp enough to sting. And Lena flinched, the reaction small but visible, and I watched as her composure fractured further, the cracks widening, the control slipping further and further out of reach. She turned abruptly, scanning the crowd, her gaze frantic now, searching for anyone who would support her, who would step forward and reinforce her version of events. But the problem with building relationships on manipulation is that they don't hold under pressure. And one by one, the people she looked to avoided her eyes, their expressions uncertain, guarded, unwilling to risk being pulled into something that was already turning against her. That was the moment it truly settled in for her. I think not when the video played, not when the accusations started, but when she realized she was alone, completely, unmistakably alone. Her gaze snapped back to me again, sharper this time, more focused, and the accusation in her eyes had solidified into something colder, something more dangerous, because she wasn't just confused anymore, she was starting to understand. Starting to piece together the possibility that this wasn't random, that this wasn't an accident, that someone had orchestrated this moment with precision, and that someone might be me. I met her stare without hesitation, my expression unchanged, my posture relaxed, giving her nothing and everything at the same time. Because the truth was, I didn't need to say a word for her to figure it out. Lena knew me. She knew how I thought, how I planned, how I paid attention to details others ignored. And if there was one person in that entire room who could connect the dots, it was her. But knowing wasn't the same as proving. And without proof, all she had was suspicion, and suspicion, without evidence, only made her look more unstable. You, she said suddenly, the word cutting through the noise as she pointed directly at me, her voice trembling but loud enough to draw every eye in the room, redirecting the focus, shifting the spotlight, dragging me into the center of the scene she was desperately trying to reclaim. You did this, the accusation landed hard. Not because it was unexpected, I had anticipated this move from the moment I set everything in motion, but because of how quickly the room reacted, the attention pivoting toward me, curiosity flaring as students turned, trying to place me, to understand my role in this unfolding drama. And for a brief moment, the narrative hung in balance again, waiting to see which direction it would tip. In my past life, this was where I would have panicked, where I would have stumbled over my words, where I would have tried to defend myself emotionally instead of strategically. And that hesitation would have been all she needed to regain control, to twist the story back in her favor. But that version of me no longer existed. This time, I had already planned for this. Slowly, deliberately, I stepped forward, the movement unhurried, the sound of my footsteps faint against the polished floor, but somehow loud enough to cut through the noise, drawing attention without demanding it. And as I moved, the crowd parted just slightly, instinctively, creating a path that led straight toward the stage, toward her, toward the center of everything. And I could feel their eyes on me, their expectations shifting, recalibrating, trying to determine whether I was a victim, a culprit, or something else entirely. I stopped just short of the stage, close enough for her to see me clearly, for everyone to hear if I chose to speak. But I didn't rush into it, didn't fill the silence immediately, because silence, when used correctly, is a tool. And right now, it worked in my favor. Lena's breathing was uneven, her grip on the microphone tightening again as she waited, as she watched me, as she tried to predict what I would say, what I would do, and the uncertainty in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She couldn't read me anymore. You think I did this? I asked finally, my voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach the front rows without needing amplification. And the simplicity of the question worked exactly as intended, because it didn't deny, didn't confirm, didn't give her anything concrete to latch onto. It just forced her to commit. I know you did. She shot back immediately, too quickly, too emotionally, and there it was again, that same mistake, that same pattern of reacting instead of thinking. And I almost wondered if she realized how predictable she had become when she was under pressure. Then prove it, I said, just as calmly, just as evenly, and the words landed with a quiet weight that shifted the dynamic instantly. Because now the burden was on her. Now she was the one who had to provide evidence, had to support her claim, had to do more than just accuse. And the hesitation that followed, brief but unmistakable, told the crowd everything they needed to know. Lena opened her mouth, closed it, her gaze flickering as she searched for something, anything that could back her up. But there was nothing, because I had made sure of that, had covered every angle, every potential trace, every path that could lead back to me. And without proof, her accusation was just noise, just desperation, just another sign that she was losing control. A murmur spread through the crowd again, quieter this time, more thoughtful, more critical, and I could see the shift happening in real time. The way their perception of her continued to deteriorate, the way doubt hardened into judgment, the way sympathy faded into skepticism. And Lena felt it too. I could see it in the way her posture stiffened, in the way her expression tightened, in the way her eyes darkened with something that looked dangerously close to panic. Why would I do this? I continued, tilting my head slightly, my tone still measured, still composed, but now with just enough curiosity to make the question seem genuine, to make the audience consider it seriously, to make them engage with the logic instead of the emotion. Lena didn't answer immediately, couldn't, because any answer she gave would expose something she didn't want revealed: motive, history, conflict, and without those, her accusation had no foundation. Because you're jealous, she said finally, grasping at the most obvious explanation, the safest one, the one that had worked for her in the past. And for a moment, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what I expected. Jealous, I repeated, letting the word linger just slightly, giving it enough space to feel questionable. And then I shook my head, just a fraction, not dismissive, not mocking, just enough to plant doubt. Of what? The question was simple, but devastating, because it forced her to define the narrative she was trying to push, and in doing so, expose its weaknesses. And the silence that followed was heavier than any argument, because there was no good answer. No convincing explanation that aligned with everything the crowd had just seen. And that was the moment it tipped. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, inevitably, like a scale shifting under steady pressure. And I saw it in their faces, in the way they looked at her now, not with admiration, not with sympathy, but with doubt, with distance, with the beginning of something colder, something far less forgiving. And Lena saw it too, felt it slipping away. Everything she had built, everything she had relied on, collapsing piece by piece under the weight of a narrative she could no longer control. I held her gaze for one last second, just long enough for her to understand, just long enough for the realization to fully settle. And then I stepped back, not needing to say anything more, not needing to push any further, because the damage was already done. The first domino had fallen, and the rest would follow exactly as planned. The moment I stepped back, the shift in the room became irreversible, subtle but absolute, like a line had been crossed that no one could uncross. And Lena, standing alone under the harsh white lights of the stage, felt it more than anyone. Because for the first time since she picked up that microphone, she was no longer in control of how people saw her, no longer able to guide their reactions with carefully chosen expressions and perfectly timed tears. And the realization hit her all at once, visible in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way her lips parted as if to speak but no sound came out, in the way her eyes flickered across the crowd searching for something that no longer existed. Support, trust, belief. All gone, replaced by something far colder. The murmurs didn't die down this time, they evolved, sharpening into pointed comments, quiet judgments that carried just far enough for her to hear, for her to understand that this wasn't just a temporary setback. This was the beginning of something much worse. So she was using him. That video looked real. She even tried to blame someone else. Every word pressed down on her, each one reinforcing the narrative that had already taken root. And the more she tried to hold herself together, the more obvious it became that she was unraveling. Stop it, she snapped suddenly, her voice louder than before, edged with something raw, something unpolished. And the reaction was immediate, not silence, not sympathy, but surprise, because this wasn't the Lena they knew, not the gentle, composed girl who always seemed so easy to like. And that break in character did more damage than any accusation could have. All of you, just stop talking like you know anything, she continued, her grip on the microphone tightening as her composure slipped further. And I watched carefully, noting every detail, every shift, every mistake, because this was exactly what I had been waiting for: the moment she stopped performing and started reacting. The boy near the stage didn't interrupt, didn't escalate, didn't even move, and his stillness contrasted sharply with her growing instability, making her look even more frantic by comparison. And I wondered briefly if he understood what was happening as clearly as I did, if he could see the pattern, the way she was destroying herself without any help now, or if he was simply observing out of disinterest. Either way, it didn't matter. The outcome was the same. Lena took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself, trying to rebuild something from the fragments of control she had left. And for a second, it almost worked. Her posture straightening, her expression smoothing just enough to resemble the version of herself people were used to. But it was too late for that, too late to revert. Because once people see the cracks, they don't forget them. You all saw a video, she said, her voice quieter now, more measured, attempting a different approach. But none of you know the context. None of you know what I was actually talking about. It was a smarter angle, introducing ambiguity again, trying to reframe the evidence rather than deny it outright. And a few students hesitated, their expressions shifting slightly as they considered it. Because context matters, and she was right about that, at least in theory. But theory doesn't always survive reality. Then explain it, the same voice from earlier called out. And this time, there was no hesitation in the challenge, no softness, Just direct pressure. And Lena froze again, just for a fraction of a second, but enough to show that she hadn't prepared for this, hadn't anticipated being pushed this far, this directly, and that hesitation spoke louder than any explanation she could have given. I tilted my head slightly, observing, calculating, and then quietly, almost imperceptibly, I pulled out my phone, not to record, not to react, but to send a single message. One final adjustment to ensure that the next step unfolded exactly as it should. Because while she was busy trying to salvage the present, I was already moving ahead, already setting the stage for what came next. Lena opened her mouth again, searching for words, for a version of the truth she could twist into something acceptable, something survivable. But before she could speak, before she could attempt to regain even a fraction of control, a new voice cut through the noise, calm, clear, and entirely unexpected. I think she means this. Context. All eyes turned instantly, drawn toward the source, and a student near the front, someone quiet, someone unremarkable, someone Lena would never have considered a threat, stepped forward slightly, holding up his phone with a faint, almost apologetic expression, and for the first time since this began, I saw something close to real fear flash across Lena's face. I wasn't going to say anything, he continued, his tone hesitant but firm enough to carry. But if you're asking for context, he turned his screen outward, not projecting it, not amplifying it, but enough for those closest to see. And as they leaned in, as their expressions shifted from curiosity to recognition, the ripple spread again, faster, this time sharper, because this wasn't just one piece of evidence anymore, this was a pattern. Lena's breathing hitched, her entire body going still as she stared at him, as she tried to process what he might have, what he might show, and I could almost see the calculations running through her mind, the frantic attempt to predict, to prepare, to counter. But it was already too late for that. It's from last week, he said, scrolling slightly, his movements careful, deliberate. You were talking to someone behind the science building. A pause, just long enough to let the implication settle. You said you didn't actually like him, that once you got close enough, you'd have access to his family's connections. The words weren't shouted, weren't dramatized, but they didn't need to be, because they aligned perfectly with what the video had already shown, reinforcing it, validating it, turning it from a single piece of questionable evidence into something much harder to dismiss. And the effect was immediate, the crowd reacting with renewed intensity, the doubt solidifying into belief, the narrative locking into place in a way that couldn't easily be undone. That's not. Lena started, her voice breaking, but she stopped herself abruptly, the denial dying on her lips as she realized how it would sound, how it would look, how it would only dig her deeper into the hole she was already trapped in. And the silence that followed was deafening, heavy with everything she couldn't say, everything she couldn't fix. I watched her closely, noting the exact moment it happened, the shift from resistance to something else, something darker, something colder. As her expression changed, the panic receding just enough to be replaced by a thin, brittle composure. And when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, quieter, but no less dangerous. So that's what this is, she said slowly, her gaze moving across the crowd before settling on me once more, sharper now, more focused, more certain. You set this up. It wasn't a question this time, it was a conclusion. And while the others might not have fully followed her reasoning, might not have connected the dots the way she had, I knew she was closer to the truth than anyone else in that room. I held her gaze unflinching, my expression giving nothing away, because acknowledging it wouldn't benefit me, denying it wouldn't matter. And the uncertainty, that thin space between what she knew and what she could prove, was exactly where I wanted her. You think too highly of yourself, I said calmly, my tone almost indifferent, and a few students shifted, their attention snapping back to the exchange between us, the tension refocusing, sharpening, because now it wasn't just about her anymore, it was about us. Not everything is about you. The words were simple, but they landed exactly where they needed to, undermining her conclusion, reframing her accusation as arrogance rather than insight. And the effect was immediate, the crowd reacting with small nods, murmurs of agreement, because it fit what they were already starting to believe, that she had overreached, that she had miscalculated, that this entire situation was the result of her own actions rather than some elaborate scheme against her. Lena's jaw tightened, her grip on the microphone loosening slightly, as if she was starting to understand just how far the ground had shifted beneath her, just how little control she had left. And for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes, anger, sharp and bright, cutting through the remnants of her composure, and I recognized it instantly, because I had seen it before, in another life, in another moment, right before everything fell apart. This isn't over, she said quietly, the words almost lost under the noise but clear enough for me to hear, clear enough to carry meaning. And I didn't respond, didn't need to, because we both understood what she meant, understood that this wasn't the end of the conflict, Just the end of this particular battle. The teachers finally stepped in then. Too late to prevent anything. Too late to control the narrative. But just in time to shut it down before it escalated further. Their voices cutting through the chaos as they ordered everyone back to their classes. Their attempts at authority ringing hollow against the weight of what had already happened, and slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse, the noise fading into a low hum as students moved toward the exits, their conversations continuing in hushed, excited tones, because this was something they would talk about for days, for weeks, maybe longer. Lena stepped down from the stage without looking at anyone, her posture rigid, her movements controlled in a way that suggested she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. And as she passed by me, close enough that I could see the tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her hands, she didn't stop, didn't speak, but her shoulder brushed mine just slightly, deliberate enough to feel like a message. And I knew exactly what it meant. This wasn't over. I watched her walk away until she disappeared into the crowd, until the last trace of her presence faded from view. And only then did I allow myself to exhale slowly, the tension in my body easing just a fraction as I reviewed everything that had just happened. Every detail, every reaction, every outcome, and the conclusion was simple, clear, undeniable. Phase 1 was complete. In this time, the story was unfolding exactly the way I intended. By the time the last echoes of the assembly faded into the corridors and classrooms, the story had already evolved beyond anything Lena could contain, twisting and spreading through whispered conversations, private group chats, and stolen glances that lingered just a little too long whenever she passed by. And I moved through it all like a shadow, present, aware, but untouched, because this wasn't the part where I needed to act visibly. This was the part where the narrative settled, where perception hardened into belief, and belief into judgment. And the difference between those stages was where most people failed, where they pushed too hard or too fast and exposed themselves. But I had learned that lesson the hard way in my previous life. Learned that timing wasn't just important, it was everything. Lena didn't come to class that afternoon, and that alone was enough to confirm what I already knew. She was regrouping, recalculating, trying to rebuild control from the fragments that remained. And I didn't underestimate her for a second, because if there was one thing she excelled at, it was adapting under pressure, reshaping herself to fit whatever version of reality would benefit her most. And that meant she would come back stronger, sharper, more careful, which was exactly why I couldn't stop now. Letting her recover fully would be a mistake. Giving her time to reconstruct her image without interference would allow her to turn this into a temporary setback, instead of a permanent fracture. And I had no intention of letting that happen. So instead of waiting, instead of reacting, I moved forward. The first step was simple information. I already had enough to damage her reputation, but not enough to destroy it completely, not enough to ensure she couldn't recover. And that distinction mattered, because partial truths can be explained away, can be reframed, can be diluted over time. But a pattern, a consistent, undeniable pattern, was much harder to escape. And Lena had left traces everywhere. She always did. The difference now was that I was looking for them. I sat at my desk, phone in hand, scrolling through archived messages, saved files, small fragments of conversations that most people would ignore, but that, when connected, formed something much more revealing. And one by one, I began to organize them, categorizing, cross-referencing, building a timeline that showed not just isolated incidents, but intent, calculated, repeated, deliberate intent, her interactions with different people, the way her tone shifted depending on who she was talking to, the promises she made, the contradictions between them. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to piece it together. And as I worked, I felt that familiar clarity settle, the same cold focus that had once made me top of the class, the same precision that had once been used for something as simple as academic success, now redirected towards something far more complex: exposure. But raw data wasn't enough. Information, no matter how accurate, needed context, needed framing, needed to be delivered in a way that guided interpretation rather than leaving it open to chance. And that was where most people failed, where they assumed the truth would speak for itself, when in reality, the truth is only as powerful as the way it's presented. Which was why I didn't release everything at once. Instead, I chose carefully, a message here, a screenshot there, nothing overwhelming, nothing that could be dismissed as an obvious attack, just enough to reinforce what people were already starting to believe, just enough to deepen the cracks that had formed during the assembly. And I timed each release with precision, spacing them out so that the story never fully settled, never had time to fade, each new piece reigniting the conversation, pulling Lena's name back into focus just as it began to drift away. By evening, the shift was undeniable. What had started as a single incident had become a pattern, a narrative that people could follow, discuss, dissect, and most importantly, believe in. Lena, no matter how skilled she was at manipulation, couldn't easily fight something that existed in so many places at once, couldn't confront every conversation, couldn't control every interpretation, but I knew she would try. The next morning proved it. She walked into class like nothing had happened, her posture straight, her expression calm, her usual softness carefully restored. And for a moment, if you didn't know better, you might believe she had recovered completely, that she had already found a way to turn things back in her favor. But I wasn't looking at the surface, I was looking at the details. The slight tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze lingered just a fraction too long on certain people, the controlled rhythm of her breathing, and most of all, the way she avoided looking at me, not fear, not yet, but awareness. She knew, or at least, she suspected enough to be cautious. Good. That meant she would be careful, and careful people make fewer mistakes, but when they do make them, those mistakes are often far more revealing. The class settled into its usual routine. The teacher speaking, students taking notes, the illusion of normalcy reestablishing itself. But beneath it, the tension remained, subtle but constant, like an undercurrent that refused to dissipate. And I could feel it in the way people interacted, in the way conversations paused when Lena approached, in the way glances were exchanged behind her back. And I knew she felt it too, knew she was tracking it, analyzing it, trying to determine how much damage had been done and how best to repair it. Which was why I waited. I didn't act immediately, didn't push further, because this was the moment where patience mattered most, the moment where she would make her move. And whatever that move was, it would reveal exactly how she intended to fight back. It didn't take long. By lunch, the first counterattack appeared, a message, circulating quietly at first, then spreading more rapidly as people shared it, discussed it, questioned it, and when I finally opened it, I found exactly what I expected and exactly what I had prepared for. It was a story, not a direct denial, not a confrontation, but a narrative, one that painted Lena as a victim, someone who had been misunderstood, taken out of context, targeted by someone with a grudge, and woven into that narrative carefully, subtly was me. Not named explicitly, not accused outright but implied, suggested, positioned as the possible source of the leaks, the one who stood to gain from her downfall, the one who had always been quiet, observant, too perfect, the kind of person people could easily imagine hiding something beneath the surface. It was well done, clever, just vague enough to avoid direct confrontation, just detailed enough to plant suspicion, and I could see the effect almost immediately. The way some people hesitated again, the way the narrative wavered, the way doubt began to re-enter the conversation. If I had been the person I was in my past life, this would have been the moment I panicked, the moment I rushed to defend myself, to deny, to explain, and in doing so, confirmed everything she implied. But I wasn't that person anymore. I didn't respond, not publicly, not immediately, because reacting to her narrative would only strengthen it, only validate the idea that there was a conflict between us worth paying attention to. And that was exactly what she wanted, to shift the focus from her actions to our dynamic, to turn this into a personal dispute instead of a pattern of behavior. So instead, I did what she didn't expect. I expanded the pattern. Another piece of evidence surfaced that afternoon, this time. A conversation between Lena and a different student. One where she made a similar promise, a similar calculation, positioning herself in a way that directly contradicted the image she was trying to rebuild. And this time, I made sure it reached the right people first, the ones most likely to spread it further, the ones whose opinions carried weight. And within an hour, her narrative began to fracture again, the doubt she had tried to redirect slipping back toward her, the focus returning to what mattered, her actions, her intent. By the end of the day, the balance had shifted once more, not completely, not decisively, but enough to prevent her from regaining full control, enough to keep the pressure on. And as I packed my bag and prepared to leave, I could feel her gaze on me for the first time since morning, steady, measuring, no longer avoiding, no longer uncertain. I looked up slowly, meeting her eyes across the room, and this time, there was no accusation, no panic, just calculation. She understood now, not everything, not the full extent of what I was doing, but enough to recognize that this wasn't random, wasn't accidental, wasn't something she could simply outmaneuver with a single well-placed story. This was a game, and she was no longer the only one playing it. "You're not going to stop, are you?" she said quietly when the room had mostly emptied, her voice low enough that no one else would hear, but clear enough that I couldn't ignore it. And I considered the question for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to see if she understood it too. "Would you?" I replied, my tone just as calm, just as quiet, and the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips, not warm, not friendly but sharp, acknowledging, because that was the truth neither of us needed to say out loud. No, we wouldn't. And as we stood there, facing each other in the fading light of the classroom, the distance between us filled not with words, but with something far more dangerous: understanding. I realized that this was no longer just about revenge. This was about control, and the game had only just begun. By the third day, the atmosphere of the school had changed in a way that couldn't be undone. Not with a single apology, not with a carefully crafted explanation, not even with time, because the narrative surrounding Lena had evolved into something far more complex than a simple scandal. It had become a pattern people believed they understood. And once people think they understand you, they stop giving you the benefit of the doubt. They stop questioning contradictions. They stop looking for nuance. And that was exactly the position she was in now, standing in the center of a story that no longer belonged to her. But Lena didn't collapse. That would have been too easy. Instead, she adapted again, but this time, the shift was sharper, more deliberate, less concerned with maintaining her old image and more focused on survival. And I saw it immediately in the way she moved through the halls, no longer trying to greet everyone, no longer softening her voice or expression to fit expectations, but instead choosing her interactions carefully, speaking less, observing more, and most importantly, watching me. She had stopped pretending she didn't know. Good. That meant we could move forward. The first sign that she had changed her strategy came during the afternoon break, when a small group gathered near the courtyard, their voices low but tense, the kind of conversation that draws attention without trying. And I didn't need to get close to know it involved me, because I could feel the shift in the way people glanced in my direction, quick and subtle but frequent enough to matter. Lena stood at the center of that group, her posture composed, her tone controlled, and as I approached just close enough to hear, I caught the tail end of her sentence. "I never said she did it," Lena was saying, her voice calm, almost reasonable. "I just think it's strange how everything started at the same time she got involved." It was a cleaner approach then. Before, no direct accusation, no emotional outburst, just implication, suggestion, planting seeds instead of throwing stones. And I almost appreciated the refinement, because it showed she had learned from her earlier mistakes, had adjusted her method to something harder to counter directly. "You mean the video?" someone asked, hesitant but curious, and Lena nodded slightly, not pushing, not forcing the narrative, just guiding it. "And the messages," she added, just enough detail to reinforce the idea without overcommitting. And I could see the effect immediately. The way doubt began to resurface in some of their expressions, the way uncertainty crept back in, subtle but present, because people don't like complexity, they prefer simple explanations, clear villains, easy conclusions, and Lena was offering them one. I didn't interrupt, not yet, because stepping in too early would only validate her implication, would turn this into a direct conflict again. And that was exactly what she wanted. Instead, I observed, listened, let the conversation develop naturally. Let her build just enough momentum to make the fall meaningful. "So you think she's behind it?" another voice asked, more directly this time, and Lena paused just for a second, just long enough to make it seem like she was considering the question, carefully weighing it being fair. "I don't know," she said finally, her tone softening just slightly. "I just think people should look at everything before they decide what to believe." It was well played, subtle, non-committal, and dangerous, because it shifted responsibility away from her and onto the audience, making them feel like they were drawing their own conclusions instead of being led. And for a moment, the balance tilted again, not fully, not decisively, but enough to matter, enough that I had to act slowly, deliberately. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us without drawing unnecessary attention. And when I spoke, my voice was calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach the group without turning heads from across the courtyard. "You're right," I said, and the conversation stopped instantly, every eye turning toward me, the tension sharpening as the dynamic shifted once more. And Lena's gaze met mine without hesitation, this time steady, expectant, as if she had been waiting for this, as if this was exactly where she wanted the confrontation to happen. "People should look at everything," I continued, holding her gaze, my expression neutral, almost thoughtful, and I saw the flicker of caution in her eyes, the brief recognition that this wasn't the reaction she had anticipated, that I wasn't pushing back the way she expected me to. "Which is why," I added, reaching into my bag and pulling out my phone, "I think it's only fair they see this too." There was a pause, brief, but heavy, as the implication settled, as curiosity flared, as anticipation built. And Lena didn't move, didn't speak, but I could see it in the slight tightening of her jaw, the subtle shift in her posture. She understood that something was coming, something she hadn't accounted for. I didn't rush. Timing mattered, delivery mattered, and when I finally turned the screen outward, showing the content to the group first, letting their reactions spread naturally instead of forcing it, the effect was immediate and unmistakable. Confusion, recognition, then shock. "Wait, isn't this?" someone started, but didn't finish, because they didn't need to. Because the evidence spoke clearly enough on its own. It wasn't a video this time. It was a series of messages, longer, more detailed, harder to dismiss between Lena and someone outside the school, someone whose name carried weight, someone connected to the very family she had claimed she was only casually interested in. And the content was explicit, undeniable in its intent, outlining not just a vague plan to get close, but specific steps, specific goals, specific benefits she expected to gain. Not a moment of carelessness, a strategy, a blueprint. This is fake, right? Someone asked, but the uncertainty in their voice made it clear they didn't fully believe it, not anymore. Not with everything else that had already surfaced. And Lena didn't answer immediately, couldn't, because this wasn't something she could easily reframe, couldn't be dismissed with context or ambiguity. And the silence that followed was louder than anything she could have said. I watched her carefully, noting the exact moment the realization hit. The moment she understood that this wasn't just another piece of evidence. This was something more dangerous, something that connected everything together, something that turned the narrative from suspicion into confirmation. And for the first time since this began, she didn't try to deny it right away. Instead, she looked at me, really looked at me, and in that moment, there was no pretense left, no performance, no carefully constructed image, just recognition. "You've been collecting this," she said quietly, not a question, not an accusation, but a statement of fact. And I didn't respond, didn't need to, because the answer was already there, written in everything she was seeing, everything she was realizing. The group shifted uneasily, the tension thickening as they glanced between us, aware now that this wasn't just a rumor, wasn't just a misunderstanding, but something deliberate, something controlled, something far more calculated than they had initially assumed. And that realization changed the way they looked at both of us. Not just at Lena, but at me too, because now they understood that this wasn't random. This was a game, and they were watching it unfold. "Why?" Lena asked finally, her voice lower now, stripped of the softness she used with others, stripped of everything except the core of the question. And for a moment, I considered giving her the real answer, considered telling her exactly why, exactly how, exactly what had led me to this point. But that wouldn't serve me, wouldn't change anything, wouldn't add value to the situation. So instead, I gave her something else, because you would have done the same, I said calmly, and the truth of it landed between us with a weight that neither of us could ignore. Because we both knew it was real, knew it was accurate, knew it was the one thing neither of us could deny. Lena's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze hardening just slightly as she absorbed that, as she processed it, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Not an agreement, not an acceptance, but an understanding. The group around us didn't fully grasp the exchange, didn't catch the depth of what had just been said, but they didn't need to, because the evidence was already doing its work, the narrative already shifting, the balance already tipping further in my favor. And as the murmurs began again, quieter this time but no less significant, I stepped back once more, not pressing further, not pushing the advantage, because I didn't need to. The damage was done. This wasn't just a crack anymore. This was a fracture, and fractures don't heal the same way. As I turned to leave, I felt her gaze linger on me, steady, unyielding, and I knew without looking back that this wasn't over, that she would adapt again, would find another angle, another strategy, another way to fight, because that was who she was. And in another life, in another version of this story, I might have admired that, but not here, not now, because this time, I wasn't going to let her win. By the end of that day, the fracture had deepened into something far more permanent, something that no amount of careful words or calculated composure could fully repair. And yet Lena didn't retreat the way most people would have after being exposed so thoroughly. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She stayed visible, but controlled, choosing her appearances, limiting her interactions, and reshaping the way she was perceived, not by denying what had surfaced, but by absorbing it, redirecting it, turning herself from the center of the scandal into someone navigating through it. And I recognized the strategy immediately because it was effective, frighteningly so, especially against an audience that was already growing tired of constant revelations and beginning to crave a sense of stability again. She stopped defending herself directly, stopped arguing, stopped reacting emotionally, and instead began to behave reasonably. That was the key. In class, she answered questions calmly, even when people whispered about her. In group work, she contributed just enough without trying to lead. When someone brought up the rumors, she didn't deny them outright, she acknowledged them lightly, almost distantly, as if they were misunderstandings that would eventually sort themselves out. And that shift began to work, slowly but undeniably, because people are far more willing to forgive someone who doesn't fight back aggressively, someone who seems composed, someone who appears to accept scrutiny instead of resisting it. I watched it happen in real time, the way the tension around her softened just slightly, the way conversations about her lost their sharp edge, The way doubt began to reintroduce itself, not in her favor exactly, but enough to weaken the certainty I had built. And that was when I understood her next move. She wasn't trying to win back her old image. She was building a new one, not the innocent girl everyone trusted, but the misunderstood one, the one who had been targeted, the one who had made mistakes but didn't deserve the level of scrutiny she was receiving. And if she succeeded, if she managed to shift the narrative from manipulative to unfairly judged, then everything I had done so far would lose its weight, would become just another exaggerated story in a school full of them, which meant I couldn't let her stabilize the situation, not yet, not when the outcome was still in motion. That afternoon, I made a decision not to expose more, not to escalate in the same way, because repeating the same tactic would only make the pattern obvious, would make it easier for her to frame everything as a coordinated attack, but to change the angle entirely. If she wanted to control perception, then I would control context. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A school meeting was announced for the following day, an open forum, meant to address recent incidents and restore order, a chance for students to speak, to clear misunderstandings, to reestablish some sense of normalcy. And while most people saw it as a way to calm things down, I saw it for what it really was, a stage. A larger one, a more formal one, and far more dangerous. Lena saw it too. I could tell by the way her gaze sharpened when the announcement was made, the way her posture shifted just slightly, the way she went still for half a second before returning to that carefully composed demeanor she had adopted. And in that moment, without a single word exchanged, we both understood exactly what was about to happen. This wasn't going to end quietly. That evening, while the rest of the school buzzed with speculation about what the meeting would bring, I finalized the last piece of my plan, reviewing everything one more time, every detail, every sequence, every possible outcome, because unlike before, this wouldn't be a gradual unraveling. This would be direct, undeniable, and most importantly public in a way that couldn't be contained or rewritten afterward. Not just exposure, conclusion. The next day, the auditorium filled faster than usual, the atmosphere charged with anticipation, because everyone knew this wasn't just a routine meeting. This was the continuation of a story they had been following for days, and now finally, they would see how it played out. And as I took my seat, a few rows back, I could feel the energy in the room, the way conversations hushed as teachers took their positions, the way students leaned forward slightly waiting, watching, expecting something to happen. Lena sat near the front, composed as always, her posture perfect, her expression calm, and if someone had walked in at that moment without context, they might have thought she was completely unaffected, completely in control. But I knew better, and when her eyes flickered briefly toward me, just for a second, I saw it, the focus, the readiness, the same understanding that had passed between us the day before. This was it. The meeting began as expected, formal, structured. Teachers speaking about respect, about rumors, about the importance of truth and accountability, but the words felt hollow, disconnected from the reality everyone in that room was actually there for. And the longer it went on, the more restless the audience became, the more obvious it was that they weren't interested in general statements. They wanted specifics. They wanted resolution. They wanted an ending, and then finally, the opportunity appeared. If any student would like to address recent concerns, one of the teachers said, their tone measured but slightly strained, you may come forward and speak. There was a pause, a long one, the kind that stretches just enough to build tension, to make people wonder who will move first, who will take the risk, who will step into the spotlight. And for a moment no one did. Then Lena stood smoothly, confidently, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment. A ripple moved through the room, quiet but immediate, every eye tracking her as she walked toward the stage, her steps steady, her expression composed, and I didn't move, didn't react, just watched, because this was her play now, her attempt to reclaim the narrative in the most public way possible. And I wanted to see exactly how she would do it. She took the microphone, her fingers steady this time, no tremor, no hesitation. And when she spoke, her voice was clear, controlled, carrying effortlessly through the auditorium. I know there have been a lot of rumors about me, she began. And the phrasing was deliberate, not accusations, not scandals, just rumors. Something lighter, something less concrete, and already, I could feel the subtle shift in perception she was trying to create. And I understand why people are confused. She continued, her tone softening just slightly, enough to seem sincere without appearing weak. Because some of the things that have been shared look bad, honest, acknowledging, smart. She wasn't denying, she was reframing. But what you've seen is only part of the story, she said. And there it was, the pivot, the introduction of doubt, the suggestion that context had been manipulated, that the narrative was incomplete. And I could see it working, the way some students leaned in, the way their expressions shifted from judgment to curiosity, because people always want to believe there's more to the story, especially when it allows them to reconsider their earlier conclusions. I made mistakes, Lena admitted, lowering her gaze briefly before lifting it again, meeting the audience with just enough vulnerability to feel real. But I never intended to hurt anyone, and I think someone wanted it to look worse than it really was. There it was. The implication subtle, controlled, perfectly placed, not naming me, not accusing directly, but guiding the audience toward the idea that there was a hidden hand shaping everything they had seen. And for a moment, a brief, dangerous moment, it worked. The room shifted, not completely, not decisively, but enough. Enough that if I did nothing, if I let her continue, she could rebuild just enough credibility to survive this, to turn everything into a misunderstanding instead of a conclusion. And that was something I couldn't allow, so I stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to draw attention when it mattered. Just enough to shift the focus back without breaking the flow completely. And as I moved toward the stage, I could feel the tension snap into something sharper, more focused, because now finally, the two sides of the story were about to collide in the same space. At the same time, in front of everyone, Lena saw me coming. Of course she did. And for the first time since she started speaking, her expression changed. Not much. Not enough for most people to notice. But I saw it. The slight tightening. The brief flicker of something that wasn't fully under control. And I knew then that she understood what was about to happen. I stepped onto the stage beside her, close enough to share the space but not the spotlight. And when I spoke, my voice was calm, even, carrying through the room with the same clarity hers had moments before. "You're right," I said, echoing her earlier words, and the familiarity of the phrase wasn't accidental, because it created a connection, a continuity, something that made the audience lean in instead of pull away. "People should see the whole story." Lena didn't interrupt. She couldn't, not without breaking the composure she had just rebuilt. So she stood there silent, watching, waiting, calculating. And I met her gaze for a brief second before turning back to the audience. "So let's show them everything," I continued. And this time, there was no subtlety, no gradual reveal, no careful pacing, because this wasn't about building tension anymore. This was about ending it, about bringing everything together in a way that couldn't be undone, couldn't be reframed, couldn't be ignored. This was the final move of the game we had been playing since the moment I chose not to stop her on that stage. And this time, I wasn't going to hold anything back. The moment the words left my mouth, the entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath, the kind of silence that only exists when something irreversible is about to happen, when everyone present can feel instinctively, undeniably, that they are standing at the edge of a moment that will define everything that comes after. And I didn't rush to fill it, didn't speak again immediately, because anticipation is a weapon. And right now, it was working exactly as I intended, stretching the tension tighter, sharper, until even the smallest movement felt amplified. Until every eye in the room was locked onto the stage, onto Lena, onto me. Lena didn't move either, not yet, but I could see the shift in her posture, the subtle tightening of her shoulders, the way her fingers curled just slightly around the microphone, betraying the pressure she was under despite the calm expression she still tried to maintain. And for a brief second, we stood there like two opposing forces balanced on the same point, both aware that only one of us would walk away from this with control intact. Then I lifted my phone, a simple motion, small, controlled, but it carried weight, because everyone in that room had already learned what it meant when something appeared on a screen at the right moment. And a ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd, quiet but electric, as I connected it to the projector without a word. The screen behind us flickered to life, not with a single image, not with one piece of evidence, but with a timeline, clean, structured, impossible to misinterpret, dates, messages, clips, names, every piece of information that had surfaced over the past few days, arranged not as isolated incidents, but as a continuous sequence, each part leading into the next, each detail reinforcing the one before it. And the effect was immediate. The scattered confusion that Lena had tried to cultivate collapsing under the weight of something far more dangerous: clarity. "You said people should see the whole story," I said calmly, my voice steady as I stepped slightly to the side, giving the screen full visibility. "So let's start from the beginning." Lena's silence was louder, now heavier, because she understood exactly what she was looking at, understood that this wasn't something she could interrupt or redirect without making it worse. And for the first time since she stepped onto the stage, she didn't try. She watched, just like everyone else. The first segment played a clip from the cafe, the same one that had circulated before, but this time extended, uncut, showing not just the line that had already gone viral, but the conversation surrounding it, the context she had tried to reclaim. And instead of softening the impact, it did the opposite, reinforcing the intent behind her words, stripping away any plausible deniability she might have held onto. The murmurs began again, Quieter this time, not explosive but heavy, the kind that signals understanding rather than shock. And I didn't pause, didn't let the moment settle, because this wasn't about individual reactions anymore, this was about momentum. The next piece followed immediately. Messages, multiple conversations, different names, same pattern, promises tailored to each person, intentions adjusted depending on what she wanted from them. Not coincidence, not misunderstanding, strategy. Lena's grip on the microphone tightened, just slightly, and I saw it, saw the exact moment her control began to fracture again. Not visibly enough for everyone to notice, but enough for me, enough to confirm that this was working exactly as planned. This isn't about one mistake. I continued, my tone even, almost detached, as if I were presenting a case rather than exposing a person. And that distance made it harder to argue against, harder to frame as personal. This is a pattern, another shift in the room, subtle, final. Because patterns are harder to forgive than moments. Patterns imply choice, repetition, intent. Lena took a breath, slow and controlled, and finally stepped forward slightly, lifting the microphone as if to speak, as if to interrupt, to reclaim something, anything. But before she could, the screen changed again, this time. It wasn't just her, it was the connection, the messages between her and someone outside the school, someone whose name carried weight, whose involvement turned this from a personal scandal into something larger, something more calculated. And the moment that name appeared, the atmosphere shifted again, sharper, more focused, because now the story had expanded beyond what anyone expected. Lena froze completely. No movement, no attempt to speak, just stillness, as if her mind had finally reached a point where there were no more immediate responses, no more strategies left to deploy in real time. And for the first time since this began, she looked unprepared. You weren't just trying to get close to him, I said, my gaze steady on her now, no longer addressing the crowd but her directly, because this was the moment that mattered, the moment where everything converged. You were following instructions. The words landed cleanly, cutting through the remaining noise, leaving nothing but the truth behind them. And Lena's eyes snapped to mine, sharp, intense, filled with something that wasn't panic anymore, wasn't even anger, it was recognition, full, undeniable. She knew there was no recovering from this. The room didn't erupt this time. There was no immediate outburst, no loud reaction, just a heavy, suffocating silence as everything settled, as every piece fell into place, as the story reached its conclusion in a way that didn't need to be explained further. And that silence was far more powerful than any reaction could have been, because it meant they understood, fully, completely. Lena lowered the microphone slowly, her fingers loosening around it as if it no longer served a purpose, as if the role she had been playing no longer existed. And for a moment, she said nothing, did nothing, just stood there under the lights with nowhere left to hide, nowhere left to redirect the narrative, nowhere left to go. Then quietly, almost calmly, she spoke. You've been planning this from the start, not a question, a statement, and I didn't deny it. Yes, I replied simply, because at this point, denial would have been meaningless, unnecessary, and the honesty, stripped of emotion, carried more weight than any defense ever could. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, not warm, not amused, but something sharper, something acknowledging, and she nodded once slowly, as if confirming something to herself rather than reacting to me. Then I guess I lost, she said, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been before. Because this wasn't panic anymore, wasn't desperation, this was acceptance, cold and clear and final. I watched her for a second, just long enough to understand that she meant it, that she wasn't going to fight this particular battle any further. And then I shook my head, just slightly. No, I said, my tone just as calm as before. You didn't lose because of me. Her gaze lifted again, meeting mine, a flicker of confusion breaking through the composure she had just regained. And I held it steady, unyielding, making sure she understood every word that came next. You lost the moment you thought you could control everyone. I continued, and the truth of it settled between us, heavier than anything else that had been said. Because it wasn't just an accusation, it was a conclusion, one she couldn't argue against, one she couldn't reframe. Lena's expression didn't change much, but I saw it, the slight tightening around her eyes, the smallest shift in her posture, and then she exhaled, slow, controlled, as if releasing the last piece of resistance she had left. Around us, the room remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. And somewhere in the distance, a teacher moved, stepping forward, finally ready to intervene now that everything had already happened. Now that the outcome was no longer in question, their voice cutting through the silence with procedural authority that felt almost irrelevant after everything that had just unfolded. But I barely heard it, because for me, this was the end, the real end. Lena stepped back from the microphone, her movements composed, almost detached, and as she turned to leave the stage, she paused for just a fraction of a second beside me, close enough that no one else could hear her when she spoke again. "This isn't over," she said quietly, the same words as before, but different now, stripped of defiance, carrying something else entirely intent. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because we both knew the truth. This wasn't the end of everything, but it was the end of this version of the story. As she walked away, disappearing into the space beyond the stage, I turned back toward the audience, toward the screen that still displayed the timeline of everything she had done, everything she had planned, everything she had lost. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a single, quiet thought, one that had driven every decision, every calculation, every step I had taken since the moment I opened my eyes in this life again. "Last time, you ruined my life. This time I ended yours." And as the silence finally broke, as voices returned, as the world resumed its motion around the aftermath of what had just happened, I stepped down from the stage, leaving the spotlight behind, because I had never needed it. I only needed the ending.